Hello, class. This is your lecture on tropical plant evolution and adaptation. In this lecture, we will explore themes in ecology. Let's get started. First, our outline. We'll learn in general what a biome is, and we'll talk a little bit about ecology. Then we'll look at one specific type of biome category, which is tropical forests, and we'll look at several different types of tropical forests. We will explore vegetation structure, focusing on the leaves, herbs, epiphytes, and stranglers in the context of ecology. And we'll finally look at some reproduction that we see occurring in tropical forests. First, some context with evolution. The flowering plants developed about 150 million years ago, and back at that time, we had supercontinents on our planet. After these landforms broke up, forming the current landforms that we have on our planet today, this ultimately created these biomes due to variation in climates of these different continents as these land masses shifted to different places on our planet. Biomes are ecosystems with distinctive communities of life, and the main factors that determine how the biome functions is light, temperature, and moisture. And as you can imagine, based upon where you live on this planet, light, temperature, and moisture can be very different. But these variations are essential because they create the unique biomes of our planet. And these biomes, as I mentioned previously, are ecosystems with distinctive communities of life. Now, many ecologists would say that temperature and moisture are the main factors that determine the dominant plants that can get established in any location. And plants are at the beginning of most food webs. They are the producers doing photosynthesis, and then they can in turn take in organic carbon dioxide and take that carbon and make it into an organic sugar by the process of photosynthesis. This vegetation in these biomes can then influence what other organisms live in that biome. And in this lecture today, we're going to focus just on tropical forests. Notice that there's a tropical wet forest or rain forest and a tropical dry forest. But there are many other biomes as well, several of which we've discussed over the course of this semester. Now, tropical forests are unique because they are one of the most diverse ecosystems on our planet. For example, a wet tropical rainforest makes up less than 5% of the biome landmass, and yet has over 50% of the species on our planet today. But with all this diversity, there must be as much adaptation to deal with the constraints of this climate and competition with other species. So let's say a few words now about ecology in general. This is going to be the relationship between plants and their environment. Ecology in general is the relationships of any living organism with their environment, but also living organisms to each other. Ecology determines whether a species or individual member of a species can survive and reproduce in a habitat. And this is key. It's all about not only surviving, but also reproducing in the context of evolution. Now, environment of each habitat is determined by two factors, the so-called biotic factors, which are living, and abiotic factors, which are non-living. Examples of biotic factors includes, for example, other organisms in that habitat. It could be fungus, bacteria, other plants, or animals, all impacting each other. Abiotic factors include things like wind, rain, sunlight, the different rocks and chemicals that make up the soil, and temperature change. So now let's focus on one biome for the rest of this lecture and really learn about the plants that live in these biomes. First up, wet tropical forest biomes are very, very humid. Because of that, they're very lush, and there are lots of amazing plants and other organisms that can live there. Now, because these tropical forests are very close to the equator in most cases, that means that the climate has a negligible seasonal temperature variation. It's more or less warm to hot all year long. Of course, the exception to this is at high altitude, because even at the equator, there are sometimes high mountain ranges, which, as you go up in elevation, you generally get colder. Also at the equator, we have very high rainfall all year long. We can see a picture of a bamboo forest in Thailand and a tropical wet forest in Panama. On the other hand, we also have dry tropical forest biomes. These also have a negligible seasonal temperature where it's more or less warm to hot all year long. But based upon the longitude and latitude, as well as any geographical constraints, these dry tropical forest biomes tend to have a 3 to 5 month dry season, followed by a monsoon season or a very wet season. And in the dry season, a lot of the plants go dormant. They drop their leaves, and even though it's hot, it almost looks like it's winter. So here we can see a dry tropical forest in Costa Rica during the dry season and a dry tropical forest in Mexico. All right, so now let's see what some of these adaptations are that plants of the tropical forest usually have. Well, the first, let's study the structure of the vegetation focusing on leaves. And we're going to have a couple slides here looking at leaf adaptations. Many tropical forest plants are subjected to intense ultraviolet radiation based upon their position at the equator. It's closer to the sun than are the poles of our planet. Because of this, the canopy leaves, even in wet forests, are exposed to recurrent dry periods. Because that sun is so intense, the water evaporates very quickly. Therefore, most tropical plants have evergreen leaves with a thick cuticle and a leathery appearance. Here we can see two different plants from the fig family and the eucalyptus family that have those unique leaf adaptations. Another unique leaf adaptation is we often see the anthocyanin flush common in young emerging leaves. Recall that anthocyanin is a water-soluble pigment, and as young leaves emerge, the leaves are pumped full of anthocyanin. We believe this is going to be for anti-herbivory, because often these pigments are going to be bitter, so they'll taste bad. But it can also confuse herbivores. Herbivores are looking for green leaves, so they might not even see this red leaf with an anthocyanin flush. Also, in tropical forests, the leaves are often compound. So we see not simple but compound leaves subdivided into leaflets. Here we can see a species from the genus Ceiba from the Malvaceae family. Another common adaptation for leaves is drip tips. And this has to do with the fact that there is lots of water in these forests. Even a dry forest will have a monsoon season where the leaves are going to need these adaptations to quickly get that water off of their blade. Because it's so warm, it will allow lots of bacteria or fungus to grow very easily if the surface is wet all the time. So by having a drip tip, it allows the water to quickly get off the leaf. But scientists have also discovered that these drip tips control canopy damage and soil erosion by quickly getting the water funneled to the ground in a very organized drip method. It prevents that soil from being eroded very quickly. So pretty interesting that we've discovered that drip tips protect the trees in unexpected ways. And our last leaf adaptation we see in things like pitcher plants. Pitcher plants belong to the genus Nepenthes, and they have a highly modified drip tip. So Nepenthes pitchers are leaves, and the modified leaf is called the ascidium. And here we can see that pitcher fills with water, and then little insects go in there and drown, and then the plant can absorb the nitrogen from their dead bodies. All right, so in our next exploration of the structure of vegetation in a tropical forest, let's look at the herbaceous plants. So these herbs grow in the understory of the forest. Keep in mind that the canopy of the trees is up above, and then in the dark, damp, shady understory, we have lots of herbs that can grow. Now, in a typical tropical forest, 70 to 90% are woody species. So there's many fewer herbs, and those herbs must be tolerant of low light levels. Therefore, they have to have adaptations that allow them to really magnify that ultraviolet light that is available to them so that they can maximize photosynthesis. And one of those adaptations is hairy leaves. And we'll look at those hairy leaves in a little bit more detail on the next slide. For example, here we can see a so-called African violet with very hairy leaves growing in the understory. Begonias are another common species that grow in the understory of tropical forests, and most members of the begonia family are monoecious. Remember, monoecious means male and female parts are in separate flowers on the same plant. So these herbs tend to have either velvety, variegated, or metallic shimmery leaves. And all of these adaptations are going to help magnify ultraviolet light so that these plants can more efficiently do photosynthesis. Also, velvety hairs are thought to be anti-herbivory. Sometimes the broad leaves have an anthocyanin flush on the underside of the leaf. And broad leaves that are red-purple on the bottom tend to capture the green portion of the ultraviolet spectrum that's found bouncing around the forest floor. So these leaves, such as this Calathea genus, are highly adapted to surviving life in the shady understory. Now, of these herbs, many of them are saprophytes. And saprophytes are organisms that are going to be adapted to low nutrients. So often these saprophytes are going to be feeding off of fungus mycorrhizae. Remember, saprophytes are plants, and then they can parasitize fungus to steal their nutrients. Often saprophytes are also non-photosynthetic. Because they're stealing nutrients from other species, they don't have to waste their time doing photosynthesis. Tropical rainforest floors are often very damp with lots of leaf litter. The tree canopy's constantly dropping leaves, and there's lots of bacteria, lots of fungus all breaking this stuff down. So it's amazing that these herbs can survive in this rather extreme environment. We've looked at this species before when we were studying flowers. The genus Rafflesia is one of the world's largest flowers. It has no stems, no leaves, and no roots. All it has is haustoria, which are rootlets that penetrate the plant host's vascular cylinder. It's this huge flower that smells like a corpse, and it steals all of its energy from other trees in the forest. Now, there are multiple species. Of the 28 known species, most are monoecious and the fruits are thought to be dispersed by little shrews that live on the forest floor. All right, next up in our exploration of the structure of vegetation are what are called lianas. And lianas are woody vines. Often lianas have very long stems that are rooted in the soil. And once that plant germinates, it's a race to the top because there's very little light down on the forest floor. So this vine must get up a tree and then put its leaves up above the canopy trees. Often lianas exploit trees for support, and in some cases they can outcompete trees. This liana strategy is a cost-effective strategy in the struggle for light in these tropical forests. Many of you have probably heard of passion flowers. That's from the genus Passiflora. And this is a cool vine. It's called monkey ladder. And sure enough, monkeys are observed using this to climb up into the canopy. So looking at this passion flower, quiz time. What do you think pollinates the passion flower? It has large, showy flowers with tons of nectar and no fragrance. Well, if you guessed hummingbirds, that's right. These flowers just hang off of vines up in the trees, so hummingbirds are going to be most suited to getting that nectar reward. Next up in our structure of vegetation study is epiphytes. Remember, the root word epi means upon and phyte means plant. So these are plants that grow on other plants. And this is another cost-effective strategy in the struggle for light. Because it's dark on the forest floor, if you just grow on the side of a tree, you are closer to the sun. Now, epiphytes often germinate up in the tree. So the seeds fall on the sides of the trees and branches, and then they germinate up there, not in the soil on the ground. It's also important to note that these epiphytes are not parasites. So they are not stealing anything from the tree. They simply just live on the side of the tree. And many examples of plants are epiphytes. Things like flowering plants such as orchids, ferns, mosses, liverworts, lichens, and green algae, just to name a few of the different phyla that we have learned this semester. Remember back from our leaves studies, we learned about the bromeliads. Well, they belong to the family Bromeliaceae, and they have these very unique adaptations with their leaves for storing water. They store that water in a tank, and it's perfect because these epiphytes growing on the sides of trees are really at the mercy of rainfall. They only get water when rain falls down the side of a tree. They don't have roots in the soil, so they can't get it from there. And so by storing your water in a tank, it allows you to slowly absorb that water through special scales found on the surface of the leaf. Also, these bromeliads are very important habitat for many animals. Many animals, such as tree frogs, will raise their tadpoles in these tanks. Now, many types of orchids are epiphytes, and these orchids have special root velamen regions in their tissues. And this root velamen stores water so that the orchids can survive growing on the sides of trees. Now, many types of orchids also have what's called a pseudobulb, and that's a fleshy type of tissue that makes up part of their plant body. Now, it's not a real bulb because it's above ground and entirely derived from stem tissue. Remember, true bulbs are below ground, and the layers that make up the bulb are modified leaves, such as an onion, but it's still classified as a modified stem. Next up is stranglers. So this is a very unique story that also goes hand in hand with our exploration of the lianas, which are those woody vines. So many types of plants start as epiphytes, so not on the ground, but as an epiphyte. They germinate at the top of a tree, and then they slowly grow down the side of a trunk to get their roots in the soil. And then by the time they get their roots in the soil, they've pretty much strangled the tree. And in fact, many times they outcompete the tree dies, and then the liana can survive. So pretty amazing adaptation. Next up, cloud forests or tropical montane biomes. These form where moisture-laden winds encounter the mountains, and the cloud forests are more dependent on local elevation and humidity. Now, montane can have a very diverse definition in a tropical forest. It can range as low as 500 meters in elevation or as high as 4,000 meters in elevation. So that's over 12,000 feet. It all depends on local humidity. Now, within these cloud forests, much of the precipitation is in the form of a fog drip. Epiphytes are hugely successful in these cloud forests. That's because there are tons of moisture, and that's the biggest challenge for an epiphyte. So if you live on the side of a tree in a cloud forest, you're going to always have lots of moisture available. Tree ferns are very common in cloud forests. And of course, the name tree fern is a misnomer because there's not trees, there's no woody tissue. This is a fern, but the bases of the old fronds form what looks like a trunk. Now, another thing about ferns is the fronds are subdivided, and that subdivided leaf has tons of surface area that can catch the fog and then drip it down on the ground. Another unique genus is Gunnera, which is in its own family, and it has these giant leaves, very, very big leaves that capture that fog and then drip it down to the ground. All right, so now let's think about reproductive strategies in tropical forests for the last part of this lecture. First, what is pollination biology? Well, outcrossing mechanisms in trees tends to be very well developed, and it's usually animal mediated. There are very specific relationships between the trees of a tropical forest and the animals that live there. In fact, many trees in a tropical forest are actually dioecious, which is one of the most advanced pollination biology and outcrossing mechanisms that there is, because then you have a male tree and a female tree that could be miles apart, and you depend on that animal to move the pollen from one to the female parts of another. Here's an example, which is Clusia from Brazil, and you can see both a staminate flower, a pistillate flower, and that dry fruit splitting open. It's a very unique capsule. Now, there is examples of wind pollination in the tropical forests, but usually only in the early succession of that forest. So some species grow rapidly, they get higher than the others, and then they do wind pollination. But in a mature rainforest, it's too dense. There's no space for wind pollination to be successful. The pollination of many flowers involves birds, bats, bees, and butterflies. Here we can see a little video of some butterflies that are pollinating a tree in Costa Rica. And of course, hummingbirds are abundant. They love to pollinate all of these different red tubular flowers that produce tons of nectar. Now, once those flowers get fertilized, we have seeds and fruits produced. And these seeds and fruits have to be dispersed. Many of the fruits are fleshy in tropical rainforests. In fact, about 90% of them are. And that means animals such as birds, like this toucan, are called frugivorous birds because they eat fruits and disperse them around the forest when they poop them out. Wind dispersal happens a lot as well, especially with vines, because those vines are growing up in the trees, and then they can produce a big fruit like a samara that spins down to the ground where it can grow into a new vine. And because it's wet and damp, we also see water dispersal a lot. So things like the Amazonian water lily, including the genus Victoria, has a fruit that develops underwater until it matures to release its seeds. The seeds then float away until they become waterlogged, where the seed will sink and start to root itself to begin the next generation. All right, so I hope that was interesting for you to learn about biomes and ecology in the context of a tropical forest. We've learned about vegetation structures, focusing on leaves, herbs, epiphytes, and stranglers for our case study. And then we learned all about the pollination biology and seed and fruit dispersal in general for tropical forest plants. Well, that's it for this lecture. Thank you so much for listening.